that are keys on this is what we call the enhanced bilateral engagement and cooperation with international institutions. This is sort of like the notion that the United States needs to negotiate with other countries and cannot just impose its will, which is a key theme in the Obama administration national security strategy. And one of the lines they use is no one nation, no matter how powerful, can meet global challenges alone. And you see this over and over again, specifically with issues of climate change, which are issues of what we call global governance, or the former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, used to say issues without passports. These are specifically things that affect everybody, whether equally or not. People contribute to the problem to varying degrees. The climate is a great example because there's a global commons, there's a public good such as clean air, clean water, protection from harmful UV rays, and the United States provides 25% roughly of the consumption and pollution in the world. And if the United States doesn't do something about it, things aren't going to get any better. But also India and China are growing both in terms of demography as well as in terms of economy. And if they don't do something about it either, if the U.S. and Europe brings down its pollution rates and China and India increase them, they'll just cancel each other out. You'll have the same amounts of problems going on here. So that's one of the key issues of that. And so there's a lot of different areas where the U.S. Under the Obama administration has done more engagement. The first is with U.S. allies. So the United States has formal military alliance with 31 countries. This is basically all of NATO, as well as Spain, South Korea, Japan, Australia, possibly Taiwan, not necessarily clear. And so there's been a greater effort within the Obama administration to reach out to most of these allies. Because the Bush administration was sort of participating in a bilateral approach with many of these countries to the extent it met their interests, but it was not done in a sustained way, and it was not done with any great listening, but essentially a lot of talking and telling them what the United States was going to do. The second area of greater sort of bilateral or international cooperation is within the United Nations, which is one of my specialties. So the United Nations, the U.S. in a couple different ways has improved things. One, the U.S. was in debt to the UN. The United States, the UN is funded by a proportion of GDP. The U.S. provides roughly 25% of all the funding for the UN. It's about 27% for the peacekeeping operations. But under the Bush administration, the United States was very much heavily in debt, over $2.2 billion. And one of the first things the Obama administration did was pay up its outstanding debt to the UN as a sort of sign of good faith. Another thing the U.S. did was it joined the Human Rights Council. So the Human Rights Council is the primary body that sort of oversees all countries' human rights behavior, and there's a number of special representatives and rapporteurs. And if you want to watch something very, very interesting, in the Human Rights Council, every single member of the UN has to appear before the Human Rights Council and defend its human rights policy. It's something called the Universal Periodic Review. It's supposed to be done every 4 years. On November 9th, the United States will appear in Geneva in front of the UN Human Rights Council, and it will have to defend all of its different positions that they've come under criticism for. So it's a pretty significant thing, because under the Bush administration, the U.S. wasn't a member of the Human Rights Council and never would have went before an international body to defend itself. So there's a huge number of lawyers and spokespeople coming from the State Department and the Pentagon and the White House who are going to Geneva on November 9th. And it's a pretty interesting process. So you can actually watch. You can't see it. It's not online. It's not broadcast. But the outcome document and the criticisms will be published fairly shortly. You can go look at them for all these other countries that have done it so far. And so at the Human Rights Council, the U.S. will come under a lot of criticism for the extraordinary rendition program, for the what is described as extrajudicial killings, specifically the U.S. drone program in Pakistan, as well as some of the limited uses of force in Somalia and Yemen and elsewhere. And so all these things will come up, and the U.S. will have to defend itself. And so this is a sort of unprecedented transparency in the U.S. foreign policy. And then the final issue was, in last September, President Obama became the first U.S. president to chair the UN Security Council. So every member of the Security Council becomes the presidency of the Security Council. So the U.S. was the president in September. The U.S. will be the president again this December. And President Obama had a chaired an event where he essentially raised the issue of nuclear nonproliferation as a pretty significant component. He got a new UN Security Council resolution passed, 1789, which explicitly makes, as a matter of international law, it illegal to transport in fissile material to non-state actors outside of the IAEA nuclear nonproliferation treaty process. This was something people had talked about for a long time, but nobody had actually done. President Obama had time to do it. Some of the other areas where the U.S. has been more engaged is in NATO, specifically to deal with the issue of Russia and the issue of the suspected threat of Iranian ballistic missiles. I think you'll see this in the Lisbon summit at the end of November, that the U.S. is going to be one issue that I follow closely is there are 5 countries in Europe where the United States maintains nuclear weapons. And there's a big debate within NATO right now whether or not the United States nuclear weapons should be returned back to the United States, or they should remain at these military bases within NATO countries. And I think there's going to be a little more flexibility towards the removal of those weapons. The strategic outcome at Lisbon will maintain them. The U.S. isn't going to pull them away, but there is a deal to be made by which the United States removes its nuclear weapons from Europe, and Russia removes some of its tactical nuclear weapons from the western part of Russia, where they border Eastern European countries. Another area where there's been a lot more cooperation is in Southeast Asia. So the United States has become a formal observing member of ASEAN. It signed the 1976 Treaty for Amity and Cooperation with ASEAN, which it never had before. President Obama also became the first U.S. president to meet all the heads of ASEAN to raise issues of concern. And the primary reason why the U.S. cares about ASEAN now, or did before, is simply China. There are all these disagreements within the South China Seas about disputed territories, maritime issues, confrontations over mineral resources underneath the seabed, and there's a tremendous focus for finding a forum to deal with this issue. And ASEAN is the one where the U.S. is most interested. The final thing I'll just say is the G8, G20 process is a significant focus of this administration. The G8 existed for many, it was the G7 and the G8, and now the G20 is trying to take on the fact that the G8 just did not represent the global South at all. And the Obama administration doesn't really care where they deal with issues. So the term they use in the States is forum shopping, which is what is the international institution, what is the international body where the U.S. can best achieve its outcome. And so the State Department is on the record that they support the G8, the continuation, but they also significantly support the G20, where you can deal with issues such as climate change and issues of financial issues. So the last two things I'll say sort of quickly that are priorities under this national security strategy. The first is nuclear nonproliferation, weapons of mass destruction, but specifically the issue of nuclear weapons. When President Obama was a senator from Illinois, his first foreign visit was he went with Senator Richard Lugar to Russia. Senator Lugar is the longtime sponsor of what's called the Nunn-Lugar program in Russia, which is in 1991 there were roughly 25,000 nuclear weapons spread throughout the former Soviet Union, secured to relatively terrible standards, fissile material which was kept in warehouses that didn't have locks. And the U.S. since then has spent something like $15 billion working with Russia to provide enhanced security upgrades, to provide accountability, and to provide some sort of standardization and regulation of Russian nuclear weapons security. So this is a big focus of President Obama. He has said repeatedly that the biggest threat to the United States yesterday, today, and tomorrow is the threat of terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons and smuggling them into the United States. And it's the thing that when I talk to people in the White House, they worry about more than anything else in the world. They have significantly increased the funding to deal with protecting nuclear weapon security. And so there's a couple of specific issues that President Obama has done to deal with nuclear proliferation. The first was he stated explicitly, to the greatest extent of any president in Prague in April 2009, that he supports a world with no nuclear weapons. And he says this will not happen in his lifetime, but it's something that he put on the record. And to get to that, a couple things they did explicitly was the signing of the New START treaty with Russia, which will cut U.S. strategic nuclear weapons by 30%. If the U.S. Senate ratifies it, I think they will ratify it probably in December, but we'll see. And the Duma will also ratify it, I believe. The other is the Obama administration did an overview of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. It's called the Nuclear Policy Review. This is an important document because under President Bush, they also did a nuclear policy review. It was a classified document, and they never released it, they never explained it. There is a nuclear policy review which exists on the Pentagon's website. Anyone can Google it, anybody can read it. There's no classified version. That is now U.S. policy on nuclear weapons. And what it does is it makes a key point of de-emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. foreign policy. And it does this in a couple ways, primarily through supporting the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This past May, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had a review conference, which was, they do this every 5 years since it was signed in the late 1960s. But in the last Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in 2005 under President Bush, there was no outcome document. The parties couldn't agree to anything, in large part because of U.S. resistance to be flexible to the needs of the world. They just sort of said, this is what we want this document to look like, and they weren't flexible. Under President Obama, they did come to a consensus, and they did agree to a document. You can find this on the UN's website. The thing that it makes very different than any other U.S. statement before is, for the first time ever, it explicitly endorses Israel to provide transparency about its nuclear capabilities. Israel is not an acknowledged nuclear power by the United States, but it's not a secret that Israel has perhaps 100 to 200 nuclear weapons and has a reactor. It can deliver these by aircraft, by submarines that were provided by the Germans, as well as by missiles. And the U.S. for the first time ever said Israel should become a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and provide transparency to its nuclear weapons. We also say this, the United States also does the same things to India and Pakistan, two other countries outside of the NPT process. But this was also unthinkable under the Bush administration. To be critical of Israel's suspected nuclear weapons program would never have happened under President Bush. And then the final thing was also in April 2010 was the Nuclear Security Summit. So this was in Washington, D.C. 47 heads of state came to Washington to pledge specific work plan on reducing the threat of fissile material and nuclear weapons and nuclear components to theft, diversion, or unauthorized use. This is the largest gathering of heads of state outside of the UN in the United States since the UN was created in San Francisco in 1945, and was a pretty significant deal. And they're going to have a follow-up conference every year, at least that's the plan. And they got a number of very good things, what they call deliverables, out of the summits. Explicitly, Ukraine, which had a significant amount of fissile material that was not secured, they agreed to send it to Russia. South Africa is agreeing to discuss its highly enriched uranium, which is in existence from the apartheid regime. And then Belarus, which is a country where has a significant amount, not a significant amount, but like something like 10 bombs worth of nuclear material that they've never really given back to Russia. They agreed to continue discussion. So there's a work plan. There have been some things achieved. It's pretty significant. So that's another thing, nuclear non-proliferation.